Hello, 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 everyone. I want to welcome you to our Faith on the Journey broadcast. My name is Jocelyn Jones, and I'm the founder of Faith on the Journey, and I'm also the author of the book Breaking the Power of the Mask. And if you are new to Faith on the Journey, we are a ministry of faith, healing, and community. And we try to do everything in our power to help you to strengthen your faith by providing you with practical resources and also connecting you with a community of believers who can encourage you along your journey. But one thing we also do is we try to dive deep into issues of faith, but we also talk about issues that we often struggle with in life as it relates to grief and loss, shame, unforgiveness, and a number of topics that we often don't talk about, but are relevant to our day to day. And so today we're going to continue a conversation around grief and loss, which is very relevant to what is happening in our times. And we actually scheduled this broadcast at a time of day where you all can just gather around the dinner table and have a relevant conversation around these issues because we've gotten away from having those conversations with our family. And these topics are important. And so if you've been following us on social media, every week I've been releasing new videos on grief and loss. I've been sending out various tools. And if you haven't subscribed already, you can do so by visiting faithonthejourney.org. Again, that's faithonthejourney.org. You can also find links to all our social media there. And we've talked about grief and loss from the perspective of trauma and some of the things that have been happening on a global scale. But today, I actually want to shift to a different type of grief and loss. And this is the type of loss that I often refer to as unspoken grief, because sometimes we have a hard time naming this type of grief that we experience, because we can often think of grief and loss as being the loss of a loved one due to death. But grief and loss is more than just that. We experience grief anytime we lose something that we care about. And so we're going to be exploring this in more detail later. But if you're interested in learning more about some of these topics, I want you to know that there's a grief resource guide available for you at faithonthejourney.org that you can pick up. And if you're not dealing with grief right now, but you know of someone, I encourage you to have them visit the website and pick up this free resource guide. It has a number of tools that are available for you. Now, as I was mentioning, when I used to think of grief and loss, I always thought about it as being related to someone passing away. And yes, we do experience that type of grief and loss, but it's not just that. When it comes to grief and loss, anytime we lose something we love, we experience that pain. And this could be a shift in someone's life related to someone losing their health, for example. So if someone loses their health or their ability to walk or their mobility, they might experience grief and loss. We also might experience grief and loss for someone who's dealing with a mental illness. Say, for instance, someone you love is experiencing PTSD. We might experience grief and loss because the person that we once knew does not seem like they're that same person anymore. So even though they're still there in that physical form, we still feel grief because that's not the person that we knew. And we also experience grief and loss when someone who we know and love might be losing their memory due to Alzheimer's or dementia or some other issue that's taking place. If they are not able to remember you, that hurts. That's an experience of loss. Same thing on their end. They might be realizing I'm losing my memory. And that's something where they'll grieve that as they're going through this process. So we're going to continue to kind of dive deep into this issue. And I couldn't think of anyone better to help me to have this conversation than this amazing woman of God, which is Deb Torres. And so we're going to bring her from backstage for us to have this conversation. And let me just read her bio to you because she has so much experience. I want you to know who we have before you here. So Deb Torres is a licensed clinical social worker, and she's the founder of the Institute for Cycles of Life. And she is a doula, a facilitator of final wishes, and of geriatric case management. Her focuses are, and these are some heavy things, Deb, that you focus on: end of life, body image, sexuality, religion, women's issues, and medical issues that impact individuals functioning in life. So heavy stuff. But she is trained in so many different areas: psychiatric disorders, gender identity issues, and she's been working in this field for over 36 years. So, Deb, you've been in this work for a very long time.
I have. Thank you so
That's
much.
wonderful. I'm so excited to have you on the show with us today. And I just wanted to ask you just really what kind of got you into this work? Not everybody's called to do this. So, what interests you to be in this space?
Sure. So 3 years ago, I started Institute for the Cycles of Life, where I helped women give birth, and then I would facilitate individuals in coming to grips with end of life issues with family. And so I started Institute for the Cycles of Life. It's the short term is ICOL. And yeah, so it's a privilege to be able to be at the birthing process as well as the dying process.
Wow. When you say it like that, I think so many people are actually really nervous and uneasy when it comes to being around people at the end of life. And you call it a privilege, which is so
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yes.
So tell me more why you consider that to be a privilege, this work that you're doing.
Jocelyn, I think that we all have a beginning of life and an end of life. And I think that individuals know when they're coming to the end of their life. And if we can be in a space that is safe to facilitate and honor their wishes, I look at that as such a privilege to be able to help in those wishes, to be able to facilitate conversations with other family members and friends about honoring them until their loved one passes. Even though it's difficult, it's such a privilege for me to be able to have those conversations.
Amen. And that's when you know it's a calling because God gives you the passion to do that. And it's so important to be in that space with people during that time.
Yeah.
But today, as we advertise, we're really focusing on the loss that people experience when a loved one is losing their memory due to some type of cognitive distortion, if you will.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you, my first question is, for the people out there who are caring for someone who has Alzheimer's or dementia or the like, what are some words of advice that you can offer them as it relates to community?
There is such power in community, Jocelyn. And I think that one of the things is that a lot of times people think that they need to do it alone, or they should do it alone, or they should be able to manage everything. And there's such a tremendous opportunity when we come together as community and as fellow believers to support one another in this journey, because it can be up to years, Jocelyn, if somebody has Alzheimer's or dementia. It's not something that is just days or weeks or months, but it's a really long-term situation. And I think that with community, it's huge. It's really important.
Yeah, I agree. The problem, though, that I believe many people run into, and I know about this firsthand because I've had relatives who struggle with Alzheimer's, is there's a shame associated with this. And so oftentimes you might be sitting at a party and you be like, oh, Uncle Bill is he seems like he's a little forgetful, but no one wants to say anything. And then when you realize it's really something going on, it's still something where you feel like you might need to keep it a secret. So tell me kind of what you've learned when it comes to that.
I think that when somebody has a disease such as Alzheimer's, I don't think that we need to shout it from the rooftops to announce it to everyone. I think that we need to kind of decide who do we want to keep in our inner sanctum of those individuals who we feel are safe to do, will understand, will acknowledge, will come on board with us. And I think that we have to start there. And it may be, Jocelyn, just one person or two people. I'm not talking like 15 or 20 people, but I just think that we have to start small. But there is a tremendous amount of shame that goes into Alzheimer's because we have a hard time accepting those changes, whether it's cognitive, mental, physical decline. We want to keep all of that information, but I just think that the benefit is really outweighed by the risk of the secrecy and of the shame, to be honest with a select few of individuals.
Yeah, that shame piece is huge. And I talk about that at length in my book, along with the grief that's experienced in life. And shame, that's a trick of the enemy, and it's something where when it comes to experiences that we have that are natural life experiences that we can undergo, there's no shame in that. But
No.
yet still, we
Yep.
feel like this embarrassment about it. And, everyone's like, my business stays my business. And I agree with you. We don't shout this from the rooftops, but at the end of the day, that community is important. And
Yeah.
so going back to your question, the first question I asked about community,
Mhm.
what would the village look like? Who
Mm,
makes up the village?
mm. So sometimes the village is a sibling. Sometimes the village is a neighbor that maybe knows the individuals. Sometimes it's a pastor. Sometimes it's an elder. I always think that it's a great idea to have a primary care physician who you trust, who you're confident in. Sometimes it's a social worker. Sometimes it's a nurse. So it's kind of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Maybe it's friends, family, long-term friends from high school, or those type of situations. So it can be different individuals in the village.
Got
Mhm.
it. Got it. But at the end of the day, you need one. You
You
need
need
a village
a
for sure.
village. You
For
need
sure.
a village. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me ask you, in terms of the grief that one experiences, and
Mhm.
I think this is two sides of the coin, because we have the caretaker who
Yeah.
experiences some level of grief, and those around them because they see their loved one changing before their eyes, even though they're still here. But
Mhm.
then we also have the grief that someone might experience who is actually losing their memory. And so, can you speak to that?
Sure. The word that comes to my mind is complicated grief. And you and I have talked about this. And I think sometimes people kind of want grief to be compartmentalized, and they want to like be able to put it in these little boxes. And I, as a social worker, look at grief as like the ocean. There are times where that grief is going to ebb and it's going to flow. And there are times where individuals will feel the grief like it's a tsunami, where the ocean is literally coming over you, and you feel so overwhelmed, you feel so scared, you don't know where to go, you don't know where to turn. And so not only are you losing the person in front of you that you may have been married to for 45, 50, 55 years, but they too know that they're not able to be functioning where they used to be. And so there are many, many layers to grief, but I think that all of us have to go through the different stages of grief in order to get to the next one. And you come and go, Jocelyn. It's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're done. I wish it was, but it's just not how grief works. I can share a personal story. My mom, she passed away when I was 7 years old. And there are things that will come up for me. And she's been gone 47 years. And I think that we always just have to be gracious with how we grieve and how we mourn, and not to run away and not to shy from the grief, but to actually embrace it and honor that individual.
Yes, honoring that individual. So,
Mhm.
what are a couple ways you've seen your clients honor their loved ones?
They don't argue about small stuff.
Mm.
If someone says who has Alzheimer's, because they may get fixated on something and they may see, do you see Jocelyn over there? Jocelyn, there's nobody over there. And one of the things that I see is when a caregiver, you don't get into that space of arguing, saying, now I told you, Harry, Jocelyn's not here. Yes, she is. And we don't get into that argument because that is part of the disease process. The other thing that I see with a lot of honoring is that sometimes people get really very passionate about maybe having a bran muffin at 10 o'clock and a turkey sandwich. And if they say, I want a Portillo's chocolate shake at 9, they honor them by going to Portillo's and getting the chocolate shake. And I think that that's honoring, because you're really being guided by what their wishes are, whether it's verbally, whether it's, food wise, whether they want to turn around halfway, if they're going around the block because they're tired or out of breath. I think that those are like 3 ways just off the top of my head that we honor individuals, because we meet them where they are. They may not be able to walk around the block in its entirety. But in my opinion, that's not a mountain that we really want to go down on. We want to go down on other mountains. And walking around the block, if we get half away, it's okay. If they have ice cream at 9:30, it's okay.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. So let's not sweat the small things, but there are certain things that we do need to sweat, right?
Yes,
There's certain conversations
Yes,
that
we
we
do.
have to have. And those honest conversations, sometimes people want to avoid them because they're so difficult.
Yes.
But what advice do you have when someone's like, okay, something's happening,
Yes.
business as usual has left the building. How
Yes.
do I confront this? What advice do you have?
The first thing, you need to talk to the primary care physician. That's the first thing, is you need to have an appointment, because we want to kind of rule out medically what is happening. Are there any reasons medically that these changes could be going on? The second thing I would recommend is that you need to keep a journal of the odd things that are happening. Because a lot of times what I see in practice, Jocelyn, is people come in to medical settings and individuals will say, do you have any questions or do you have any concerns? And everybody will say, no, we're good, we're good. You'll get home and in 10 minutes, I had 15 statements and you forgot. So I am always about writing things down. If your loved one is showing some memory changes, some memory decline, because we don't remember everything. We don't remember if they went to Home Depot and it took them 2 hours. But when we get to the doctor's office, we'll be like, oh yeah, that did happen. When did that happen? I don't remember. So I always encourage people to keep a notebook or a journal, and it's just like a diary, just writing down some things. So that those would be the 2 things that I would really start with.
Okay. Okay. And so you notice certain things. When is it beyond just talking to the doctor saying, okay, we have to make some changes? And how do we go about making those changes? So for example, you're like, oh, I don't know if they're safe to drive. That might be something, right?
Exactly. Safety drives this boat. And that's my concern from a social worker standpoint of view, is that if in that struggle of driving, what is so indicative is the independence, because we love our independence, Jocelyn. We love our cars. We love to be able to go to Target at 4 o'clock in the afternoon if we want, because we love that freedom. And when you're seeing someone that doesn't have the ability to make good, safe decisions, that's where we talk about a neuropsych evaluation. And that is always good to get done. Sometimes the testing is long, but it really helps because it gives us a good baseline for function and cognition and memory and what we're going with. Because a lot of times people wait too long, and so we're further down the path than where if we started earlier, we would kind of be able to have a little bit better of a handle. So I always recommend a neuropsych evaluation. And sometimes the individual won't want to go with their son or their daughter or whoever they feel comfortable with. But yeah, that would be the next step. And safety is always important. Always. It's the number one thing.
So, and if it gets to the point, it sounds like, Deb, if they're like, no, I'm not, I'm good, I want to drive, or I'm going to do this, that's when we have to kind of put our foot down.
Exactly. Exactly. And some of the local hospitals, Jocelyn, are actually doing like driving programs, to help families come together, because we know as healthcare professionals that having those difficult conversations is hard, but sometimes you need to have a neurologist or a neuropsychologist be a part of your village to have the conversation to say, you know what, you're not safe to drive anymore. And yes, that's why I think that it's important. Driving is a really big deal. And it's hard because then that means that they're reliant upon others.
Yeah, so that brings me to my next question, right? Because there's, say for instance, there's someone who's married, their spouse has Alzheimer's or losing their memory,
Mhm.
and the spouse is like, I'm overwhelmed. I don't ever get a break. This goes back
Mhm.
to the village, right? Because you had said something to me when I talked to you about a week ago about
Yeah.
how it puts such a burden on the caregiver
Yes.
that it could cause health issues for them, right?
Yes. Yes. And that's what's really hard because it goes back to the shame. It goes back to the embarrassment. I can do this on my own. And in my opinion, I don't think that God ever, intended for us to live alone. I think that he intended for us to live in community. And even though you want to honor your spouse by protecting them and caring for them and loving them well, you also need to acknowledge that you're human. And caregivers sometimes will have burnout. They will feel like they can't do anymore. And if we hire a caregiver, that means that somebody is coming into the house and they may not click as well as what they had hoped, and you really, it's a puzzle, and it's really balancing how can I maintain safety and yet also remain whole myself.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a tough balance, but it's crucial there because I know if someone's watching and they're caring for someone right now, they're nodding their head like this is a lot,
It,
and we can't have them caring for this person. They can no longer care for someone else if they're
it,
laid out, as I say, because they're just worn out from all the work that's involved. So going back to village, you can hear a
it's all the village.
common
It's
when it
all the
comes to
village.
this. Yes, yes,
And the
yes.
village sometimes goes, it'll be small, Jocelyn, then sometimes it'll grow, and that's the fluidity. That goes back to the ocean. There are going to be times where you need more people in your village, and then there are times where you're kind of smooth sailing. And that ebb and flow is kind of what is challenging when you're caregiving. But we have to keep the long picture in mind. Because we're in this thing for the long haul. So that's why we need to pace ourselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
So one thing that you said in your blog post that you wrote, if you haven't checked it out, people, I encourage you to on Faith on the Journey's website because it's a 12-step guide to supporting someone who is struggling with Alzheimer's. And you said something towards the very end that I really appreciate, and that is to love that person
Mhm. Mhm.
passionately.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. That is the crux, in my opinion, to honor anyone. It is the crux because we need to choose to love. And when somebody has dementia and Alzheimer's, it is choosing a very challenging path because and depending upon what dementia takes many forms. Sometimes there are hallucinations, sometimes there's combative behavior, sometimes there's passivity, sometimes they're not speaking, sometimes they don't want, things that they used to like. And we have to choose that, irregardless of whatever the behavior looks like, that we choose to love passionately, even in the midst of those difficult circumstances. And to me, it always comes back to loving passionately, because love is what gets caregivers into that role. Love is what gets us into a lot of roles that we play as women. And so that's why I just think that loving passionately is so important. It really is.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And in the love, on the other side of the coin of love, there's that grief that we experience,
Yes.
And so I guess if someone's listening right now who is really struggling with grief as it relates to this, what words of encouragement can you offer them?
Mm. When you are in grief, it is very easy to go inward. It is very easy to become internally shut down and just sad. And I think that there is a time for sadness and there is a time for grief and mourning. But grief doesn't paralyze us to where we can't move. And that's where I think our faith as women who believe in God, who know the value of the cross, that is where grief helps us move through. And there is encouragement. They are not alone, Jocelyn. I think that that's one of the thoughts that a lot of people that I talk to, they feel that they're not alone, but no one is alone. There are millions of people that have Alzheimer's and dementia diagnosis, millions. The support is there, but I know it's hard. And that's where I go back to the village, Jocelyn, because I'm like, even if there's one person that they trust, that they can just say, can you have a cup of coffee with me because I'm really struggling? And I'm like, have the cup of coffee. Start with, if it's only 10 minutes, then start there. But in my opinion, 10 minutes is better than zero.
Mm-hmm.
0 minutes, we're not even lifting up the coffee. And so I just,
Yeah.
when in grief, definitely, but grief does not paralyze us and we don't lose who we are, as women.
Yes, for or men too. I mean, we all have this struggle with this experience, but you're right. It's something where it's painful.
Yes.
We're able to stand still beyond the pain that we feel because of our faith, because of community and people who help to lift up our hands when we feel like we can't stand.
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit more about what you do and your services. Is there anything that you'd like to share that you think can help someone who is dealing with this right now that you offer through your company?
Sure. So I have difficult conversations with families. I talk about the taboo topics. I do. And so I am objective. I have my own family. I am married and I have 2 teenagers. And I can share this that, we talk because I'm in this space all the time and I'm talking about end of life. I tell my drug of choice is Dairy Queen. I tell my girls all the time, when mama passes away, everybody needs an ice cream cone. And with mom, we know. So Jocelyn, they've already ordered the ice cream maker so that everybody can have an ice cream cone at my funeral. And so I tend to facilitate conversations, and I do that at my heart with grace and integrity, because I know that it's not easy. But I also know, because it's a privilege and I have seen people die well, and I know that it is possible if we have communication, if we have an honest conversation. And sometimes, Jocelyn, families can't have those because of their own situations, because of their own dynamics. And sometimes you do need to have somebody come in as an outside provider to say, what are we looking at? And what are the goals here? And how can I be helpful? And what are the resources? Because one of the things that's a taboo subject is money.
Yes.
And money is, and I talk about money all day long. So
yes. And these are the things like this that you talking about. Grief. Okay, so here's the thing. I'm glad you brought that up, because when we see that they're eventually going to be making their transition soon, there's certain things that a family wants to make sure the estate has in order. And that's when you can start to see the ugly that comes out in people. So they're already dealing with this loss. But if someone passes, then we also have people fighting over, I want this, or he promised me that. And this can get crazy quick.
It can get crazy quick. Absolutely. And that, I think, is kind of what I help families, is that if Bertha wants to give the necklace to Michael, the grandson, we talk about that. And
right.
Bertha, I want you to have this. And really, it's just honoring what Bertha wants. If Bertha wants that to go to Michael, done. And then Bertha's able to kind of go through those type of things.
Yeah. No, that's good. And it's important to have those conversations. And so I think one of the biggest takeaways, if you're watching right now, is if these things are taking place in your life, it's hard to deal with, but we can't run from it because it's not going to go
No,
away.
no,
So we have to be willing to face it, to have those difficult conversations, but you don't have to have those conversations alone.
correct.
And so that's the thing. And so if anything, the key word from today has been village, community, however
Yes,
you want to put it.
yes.
But we just want to make sure that people know that they have support available. And if you have not already, if you need additional support, maybe you say, I don't have friends or family I can turn to, there is a free grief resource guide available on our Faith on the Journey website. And it
Mhm.
has information about support groups and other resources to help you to process. Because if you are a caregiver, or you see someone who you love dearly and they're going through something like this or similar, this is heavy for you. And
Yeah,
sometimes you just need a space where you can talk it out. You can share with a friend. You can just sit there in a chair and cry and not, like
exactly.
you have to be strong all the time. And so
Exactly.
these are some resources that are available. So I encourage you to download that free grief resource guide. And if you don't need it, pass it on to somebody, because
Yeah,
eventually this is something that we'll all experience, is grief. That's something we can't run away from if we're living.
exactly. Exactly.
So yes, Deb, this has been so helpful. I just wanted to know, is there any final remarks that you might share with someone who is working through this right now?
I would just say thank you for coming on. That's the first step, is you came on to really listen to what Jocelyn and my heart, I think our heart is the same, about education and honest communication and honoring in the village. And so if there's anything I can do, I'm really easy to find. And you can call me, text me. I'll be able to walk you through this difficult situation. Truly, it would be my honor and privilege. And Jocelyn, I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to
Oh,
call.
it's such a blessing. It's good to have sisters in Christ who are doing this important work. And I just appreciate your ministry, because I do call it a ministry. And I know that you've been blessing so many people. And so thank you, Deb. And
You're
thank
welcome.
you all who have been watching. Again, I hope you have been blessed. And I want you to know that this month is all about you if you're dealing with this right now. So I encourage you to check out our website, faithonthejourney.org, or follow us on Facebook or Instagram for updates that will encourage you during this time, this season, if you're dealing with grief and loss. Also, during the month of July, there is a course on grief that I'm offering for a discounted rate. And so you can find that on Faith on the Journey's website. And that course is designed to help you to navigate this wilderness of grief that many of us are dealing with right now.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
that's
mhm.
available, along with so many other tools to help you to grow your faith on the journey. And so check that out, take advantage of that, and so much more. But I hope that you return next Wednesday, same time, same place, for another episode as we continue this teaching series on grief and working on different ways that we can support you and your loved ones during this season. So thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you next week on our next broadcast for Faith on the Journey. Be blessed, everybody.
Thank you.